There's a bit of a double standard when you're arguing creation versus evolution, because science has to explain everything. And if there's anything that maybe science has explained it already, but the person doesn't know that yet. But in any case, they're thinking that if there is anything that science has not yet explained, then science hasn't explained anything, right? So they have to explain everything, or they've explained nothing. And anything that the science hasn't explained means God. I don't know, therefore magic. The double standard is religion doesn't have to explain dick about squat, because magic explains everything while explaining nothing. So we can present all kinds of scientific quandaries from many different fields, but the only thing we'll ever get from the believer is, well, that's the way God wanted it. That doesn't explain anything. But there are people who want to understand, and there are people who want to make believe. So in social media recently, I got this post. None of this could happen without an intelligent designer. A kinesin is a protein complex belonging to a class of motor proteins found in eukaryotic cells. Kinesins move along microtubule filaments and are powered by the hydrolysis of adenosine triphosphate, ATP. Thus, kinesins are ATPases, a type of enzyme. The active movement of kinesins supports several cellular functions, including mitosis, meiosis, and transport of cellular cargo, such as axonal transport and interflagellar transport. Most kinesins walk along the plus end of a microtubule, which in most cells contains transporting cargo such as protein and membrane components from the center of the cell towards the periphery. This form of transport is known as anterograde transport. In contrast, dyneins are motor proteins that move toward the minus end of a microtubule in retrograde transport. This is this guy's argument against evolution. Specifically, he's saying that you can't have new species of dogs, like I always bring up the Asian raccoon dog and the South American bush dog and the African painted dog. These cannot interbreed with wolves and coyotes and domestic dogs. There are different species within Canidae that are clearly genetically related. Any 5-year-old will tell you it's a dog, right? That's the way the creationists would argue, right? But this guy is arguing that evolution, even at that level, cannot happen because he says science has not explained how these things look like they're walking. If you look at the video that is popularly shared among the intelligent design people, they say, well, that thing looks like it's walking, therefore it must be alive, therefore it must be guided by God. So, as I am inclined to do whenever I face these situations, I like to bring in an expert, somebody that knows this field a little bit more fluently than I do, who can explain things a little bit better than I can. So, Daniel Stern-Cardinale, you are a geneticist, right?
Yeah, evolutionary biologist. My PhD is in molecular genetics and microbiology. My research is on viral evolution, so it's all kind of in that thing. Viral genetics, viral evolutionary genetics, all kind of together in there.
So what you're saying is you are a better choice for this than the way I just described you. Yes, perfect.
Sure.
So note, this guy doesn't give. He copied something from, I don't know, Wikipedia. Yeah. It sounds like a textbook. He copied it from like an online textbook, it sounds like. But he offers no explanation for how this is supposed to be a challenge to evolution. The whole argument is, I guess, that if you look at the video, it looks like it's walking. Have you seen the video? I know this is
I know exactly the video you're talking about. It goes back to like 20 years to, Discovery Institute. It's one of their might have been a clip from something like Signature in the Cell, maybe. It's a very common thing that they use.
It's kind of like cellular biology as animated by Walt Disney.
Yeah, because it's a very cartoony version of it. And I mean, this is kind of to the side of the actual kind of evolution side of the argument, but just in terms of the molecular biology, it misrepresents what's going on because at that scale, everything is different, right? It treats the cell as kind of a hollow space where these proteins are all moving around. But at that scale, when you're looking at, water molecules, right, the water molecules are actually significant size relative to the proteins that we're talking about. So they're not just walking through, empty space or like a human moving through a swimming pool. It's more like they're trying to move through like a ball pit in like a kid's, playground or something, right? It's that's kind of the kind of environment in which these things exist. So these silly animations don't do a good job actually accurately representing it. But the overall argument is just look how complex these are, therefore design. Like that's it. That's the whole argument. It's not more sophisticated than that. And I know you've talked about the concept of irreducible complexity, for decades, right? This is like the intelligent design thing. And those are the words that are missing from that paragraph, but that's basically what this is. It's you have this complex system. It needs all these different features. And if you don't have the features, it doesn't work. Therefore, it couldn't evolve. That's it. It's not more sophisticated than that.
So what I find, and this may not be possible in this particular case, because I realize, that cellular biology is intensely complicated in a way that actually argues against intelligent design. I often hear that, that a hallmark of intelligent design would be an efficient simplicity.
Yep.
But when I was taking biology in college, the advanced biology for science majors, I was kind of stunned with how stupidly complex some things were. Like it definitely argued against intelligent design to me. Why would somebody devise a system that is this apparently haphazard? I mean, it is so unnecessarily excessively complex when it could have been made much more efficiently and not have to go through this whole Rube Goldberg system.
Yeah. It really is like the cell is a Rube Goldberg system. And when you look at these pathways, you see tons of inefficiencies in terms of extraneous steps where you could just go straight from A to D, but instead it kind of does this roundabout thing. Or you have a step where it goes from A to B at a certain rate, but then it goes back from B to A at like 80% of that rate. So it actually it's very slow at getting the target thing that you want just because of the way the components interact. They're happy to go backwards. They don't care. So yeah, it's horrifically inefficient. Intelligent design proponents point to a cell and they use language like cellular machines, as though these proteins, these enzymes are literal machines with literal gears and literal wheels and literal levers. And that's not what they are. It's chemical interactions of regions that have positive or negative charges, grabbing onto each other, or regions that have the same charge bouncing off of each other, right? It's not this they love the phrase fine tuning, right? It's not this fine tuned thing where you're making a jigsaw puzzle and they fit together perfectly. You're smashing things together and sometimes they stick together and sometimes they don't.
I've seen biological diagrams of what ATP synthase, maybe that was it, or maybe it was the motor for bacterial flagellum, something with a stator in it. I mean, they describe intelligent design proponents always describe these mechanical parts that they would recognize from an appliance purchased at the home improvement depot. But when you look at the biological construct of this thing, that's what it does. You could say that this kind of rotation achieves that same purpose. It's kind of like saying that a brain is a CPU. Yeah, granted, the brain is a processing. There's only one of them, so it's a unit, and it is central. So we can say it's a CPU, but it is a bit deceptive to pretending as if your brain is a computer. Much the same thing when they draw their diagrams. The ATP synthase or whichever one of the things it is I'm thinking about right now.
Well, the thing is, just if I can, just for a second,
they don't look like the lawnmower appliance
right
kind of thing that these people draw them out to be. They make it look like that, but then you look at what it looks like in real life. You're like, yeah, that's just squishy, wibbly wobbly.
Yeah, and the reason it's funny you bring up the ATPase and the flagellum, which are two examples that creations go to all the time. those two things actually share some of their components because they're both based on protons diffused from one side of the membrane to the other through part of that complex, and the diffusion of the protons causes it to spin, and there are similarities between the parts and how they work. So it's curious that they'll say, oh, this thing couldn't evolve. Why are they so similar to each other? Because that's a hallmark of evolution, when you take one thing and you repurpose it to do a different thing, right? They always say that's a hallmark of design. Well, the pattern of similarity is not what you'd expect if there was design, because there are parts that have to be similar that, okay, you could, kind of say our creation model, our design model, whatever, accommodates that pattern of similarity. Well, the evolution model specifically predicts it. And then there are other components of that sequence that don't matter for the sequence, and you can still recreate that same pattern of similarity, that hierarchical pattern, and there's no kind of preconceived reason why under design those regions would have to follow the same pattern. So no, the specific pattern of design we see in nature is not what you would predict from design. It's actually the opposite of that. That's an important thing when they try to pull that little trick.
And what people really need to know, I want to go back to something that came from the court at Kitzmiller versus Dover in 2005, when Michael Behe from the Discovery Institute was on the stand, and he said that removing any one part of the bacterial flagellum will prevent it from acting as a rotary motor. The opinion of the court, however, says that Professor Behe excludes, by definition, the possibility that a precursor of the bacterial flagellum functioned not as a rotary motor, but in some other way, for example, as a secretory system. And then we'll skip a few of the other things that Behe says until we get to the bottom, where, again, the opinion of the court is that we therefore find that Professor Behe's claim for irreducible complexity has been refuted in peer-reviewed research papers and has been rejected by the scientific community at large. Additionally, even if irreducible complexity hadn't not been rejected, it still would not support ID, as it is merely a test for evolution, not design, because there's no way they will ever test creationism. They don't want it. They know that what they believe in, what they make believe in, is bullshit. They know that. And they dare not put it to the test because they already know it will fail.
Exactly. So I love that example with Behe and that line from the ruling, because that gets right to the heart of what we're talking about here with that comment bringing up the transport proteins like kinesins. It's exactly the same thing. Someone will point to these and say, oh, and it doesn't have to be kinesins. It could be any one of, there's hundreds of proteins, right? Probably more, that all eukaryotes have that prokaryotes don't have. And creationists love the prokaryote to eukaryote transition as this big complex jump in complexity. And we say, how could evolution do that? So the phrase I always like for this is irreducible complexity whack-a-mole, right? Because as soon as you explain how one feature evolves, right, some creationists still do the flagellum thing, but a lot have given up on that one because everybody knows the answer to that one now, right? Oh, there are flagella that are missing parts. There's the secretory systems that use the same parts, right? Everyone knows that. So they go to some other system. So the ones we're talking about here are part of this whole suite of proteins that are specific to eukaryotes. They're called ESPs, eukaryote-specific proteins. And so for this information that I have here, I'm actually leaning really heavily on a great post that was on the, Aron, I don't know if you know of the Peaceful Science Forum, but there's a lot of people talk about evolution stuff on there. So there's a great post from 2001 that actually dug really deeply into this exact question of how these types of motor proteins evolve. And the first thing to point out is that for not just these specific proteins, but like tons of these eukaryote-specific proteins, you can find homologous genes in prokaryotes that do different jobs. So you have what we think are representative of the ancestral version of those genes, and they're present in all different prokaryotes. And then you have additional copies of them in eukaryotes, and they do different jobs in eukaryotes. But the way you get from point A to point B is just gene duplication and mutations, which is a well-understood, well-documented evolutionary process. So I'm going to send you all the links to all these things. So that post on the Peaceful Science Forum and the papers with these figures in them, I'll send you the links. So if you want to link them in the video description, everyone can check them out for themselves. It's really striking. It's really striking when you look at these figures and say, okay, here's all these proteins that eukaryotes, that are unique to eukaryotes. But then you look into the genomes of dozens of different prokaryotic lineages, and you find homologous proteins to all the different groups there. They're all there. It didn't poof out of nothing like creationists want to claim it did.
And for whatever reason, I can't seem to reach these people that, what is evolution? Evolution is descent with inherent modification, right? It's what one original population eventually becomes two or more distinct subgroups, right? They don't change into something else, they're a modified version of whatever their ancestors were. They still belong to every ancestral clade or every parent clade their ancestors did, what have you. And so when we talk about, like, with the dogs, for example, okay, so you accept that the painted dog cannot breed with wolves or domestic dogs. You accept that, you understand that genetically they are distinct, right? There's a genetic lineage. They're obviously related, can no longer interbreed. They came from a common ancestor. There's two distinct subgroups, allelic variants and reproductive populations over many generations. However you want to define evolution, this is it. This is what evolution is.
Yep.
No, because you can't explain kinesins.
Right. It's this. So they want to nitpick these teeny little problems. And as you said in the introduction, it's only a one-way street, right? You can find a challenging problem in evolution. This particular commenter picked kinesins, even though we have all of these similarities in the genomes of prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And even some of these genes, they do similar things. Like there's one example where it's a separate motor protein, but it works in a similar way. It's called a kinetochore, and it moves chromosomes when eukaryote cells divide. Well, there are components of that are involved in splitting prokaryotic DNA pieces, little circular bits called plasmids, where they get dragged to opposite sides. And so it's even doing a similar job using similar components across these different things. But the bigger problem is you want to nitpick and go, oh, you can't explain this, you can't explain that. And forget about the fact that it's unfalsifiable, right? Because, as soon as you do, they just move to the next thing. But then it's never in the other direction, right? Oh, if evolution can't explain each of these teeny tiny little things with a step-by-step, mutation by mutation history, then evolution is automatically invalidated, and we go to creationism by default.
And they want transitional species to represent every single father's son.
Everything. and now look,
they want 100% of everything from this side, and they got 0% at all from this side. And so and yet they say they're winning.
And like, to be fair, right? The kind of the commenters on the internet, the non-scientists, they don't necessarily understand the kind of structure of a scientific theory, how the scientific method works, how hypothesis testing works, right? So, when you're talking to a non-scientific audience, we have to recognize that people are coming from different backgrounds and, kind of work within that framework. But then you have the professionals that are doing the exact same thing, right? Because this is fundamentally not different from Behe's trick, where he says irreducible complexity, therefore design. You don't have a pathway for how that design worked, what the mechanism of the design is, when the design happened, where the energy for it comes from, right? You don't have an explanation, right? You're just asserting as a fallback by default. That's not how it works.
Too. How does God do anything? He wills it. How?
Not a mechanism.
In any situation, anything that you think God ever did to you, right? Well, okay. Well, I met my significant other, or whatever, or our team won the game, or I found my keys, or whatever the hell it is. How did God manipulate reality for that to happen? Because at some point, if you win the game, if your team wins the game, well, then somebody's free will just went away, because God has to manipulate people on the field now.
Yeah.
And you found your keys, did he teleport them from the men's room in the restaurant you were at last night and stick him under your couch just because he knew that you were going to look there, or was there something else?
Once you once you put any kind of ongoing divine intervention into your model, into your hypothesis, whatever, it's no longer in the realm of science, and we can all just go home, right? We can just close up shop. And one of the things where intelligent design is just creationism, literally with a different name. They did the famous sloppy Control F and tried to replace it, and they messed up.
Same definition,
right? Exact word for word. That everyone knows that. But intelligent design is usually more careful about playing within the rules of science compared to the other flavors of creationism. But one thing where they completely faceplant is on this question of ongoing divine intervention, because a lot of intelligent design proponents, even if they're old Earth creationists, will say, okay, there was creation, and then there's kind of tinkering along the way, and now we're done. Now forget about it, right? Young Earth creationists, at least, they typically say, okay, it happened, and there haven't been, miracles since. Whereas the intelligent design proponents are basically proposing an ongoing series of miracles as time progresses, which takes it completely out of the realm of a scientific hypothesis, right? As soon as you start to say design happened in the observable past or is happening in the present as things evolve, then forget about it. We're done. So let me just look at my notes here. I went through everything. I mentioned the eukaryotic specific proteins. We can actually zoom in. There is a specific group of proteins called P-loop NTPases. P-loop, so P-loop refers to a specific structure in the protein, and then NTPase means it breaks a triphosphate, right? So adenosine triphosphate or one of the other ones, it breaks it into a diphosphate. So these motor proteins, these kinesins, they're part of this broad family of proteins called P-loop NTPases. And you will be shocked to learn, Aron, that these proteins are also present in prokaryotes. So in terms of being able to go from a prokaryote to a eukaryote, again, it's presented as, poof, you need all of these things out of nowhere all at the same time for a eukaryotic cell to work. When in truth, even the very specific protein family with this very specific molecular activity existed before eukaryotes existed. So now we have all the parts, we're just futzing around with them, and it's just a series of mutations to get from point A to point B. And if it's a series of mutations to get from point A to point B, what's the problem? Mutations happen. Lots of mutations happen.
The problem is, one, we're dealing with people who do not want to understand what is real, which is unfortunate. And two, the level of misunderstanding is profound. Somebody told me yesterday that, well, don't you evolutionists believe that you were once fish, then frogs, then lizards, then birds, then mammals? I mean, every stage of that.
Yeah.
There's something that needs to be corrected on every single one of those examples, but
Right.
they threw in birds. I'm used to the other without the birds in it. I'm used to
fish, frog, lizard, mammal. Yeah.
Where did somebody get the idea that we evolved from birds? So, and here's one. The worst understanding I've ever heard in my life of a creationist was, and this is somebody that I know has seen the Rudy Zollinger March of Progress painting, right, going from apes to modern man. Right? Even though that should not be a linear line, that represents a number of side branches that should be going off to the sides here and there, just for people who are not familiar. We have somebody that has seen that and has a basic understanding that we come from apes to get people. Everybody knows that part. So this person wants to teach me about evolution, or wants me to teach them about evolution. Okay, great. I'm happy to. Why don't you tell me what you understand about it? And if I see a problem, I'll jump in.
Right. Let's start there.
Here was their explanation. A bunch of molecules gather together to become a fish. And another bunch of molecules gather together to become a man.
Yeah, that's It's not how evolution works, folks. That's not how it works. I mean, look, that's
when you understand something that badly, I don't even know where to begin.
Yeah, you really have to go back to square one and just talk about just one generation to the next generation, differences due to changes that happen genetically, and just start there and like super basic. And can we agree that you and your siblings don't look identical to your parents and grandparents? Great, go back and back and back. And this
Oh
is
yeah, but and that's another thing. They don't ever want to go to what we can see and test and measure right now, what we can demonstrate today. Like dogs and chickens and things where we can actually, run tests in real time for evolution. No,
just a dog.
they want to go back to the murky past, to, as you said, to the origin of eukaryotes, to whatever they think science hasn't explained yet, or they have to. Whenever we're talking about evolution, they insist on taking it back to the Big Bang.
Yeah,
there was a Big Bang, as Ray Comfort put it. There was a Big Bang and life begins. Because like those are immediately correlated.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think some stuff happened in between there.
Yeah, like 10 billion years worth of stuff.
Yeah.
But so here's the problem. The problem really is that just these people don't want to understand. The fundamental issue is that they're not basing any of their understanding on fact. They're not trying to improve their understanding. They are trying to make believe based on authority. They were told to believe something, and they are determined to believe that, even if it's not even true.
Yeah, it's starting with, the starting point isn't information, and I'm drawing conclusions from the information. The starting point is, this is my identity. This set of beliefs is part of my identity, and I'm going to fit the facts into that box as best I can, right? And so, and that's the lay audience, right? For the professional creationists, that's kind of the situation. Now, they, in my mind, I think, have a bit of an excuse, because if you're not trained in science, then you're susceptible to that kind of thing, which is by design. Because for the professionals, right, the organizations like Answers in Genesis and Discovery Institute and all the rest, they're not doing that thing. They're starting with the worldview. They're starting with the identity. And then they're extrapolating from that a political project. And creationism is just one facet of that political project. And I've said this before, I will go to the grave saying this: nobody respects the lay audience for professional creationists less than the professional creationists, right? Because they know that they're using their audience as political pawns to advance their right-wing Christian nationalist political project, right? That's ultimately what the goal is here. And the various flavors of creationism are just one piece of that puzzle.
Yep. And I've gotten that admission when I first became active in this. It was because there was a fundamentalist Christian organization that just confessed to me up front. It's not that we necessarily want everybody to believe in creation just because we want them to find Jesus. It's because we want to take over the country and force everybody to worship Jesus, whether they believe in him or not.
Yeah. Prior to their kind of late 90s reinvention, Discovery Institute was fairly explicit about this as kind of the, it was, I think it was 1996, Michael Behe published Darwin's Black Box. And it was sometime somewhat after that. I want to say, I might have the years wrong, but it was, late 90s, like 98, somewhere around there. They changed the name of their intelligent design think tank kind of thing from the Center for the Renewal of Science and Culture to just the Center for Science and Culture. And they have gone through many iterations of the logo that have become more and more secular over, each change. But if you go back to the stuff that they were doing in like the early 90s, they're not hiding the ball like they are now. And like they were in 1998, 1999, 2005, right? You go back to I forget when they were founded. It's late 80s, early 90s. You go back to then, they were straight up like exactly what that project was. And it was explicitly political, funded by like some right-wing, essentially theocrats that wanted a think tank to promote their ideas and lobby politicians and everything. And then, decades go by and they obscure that history and it filters down through their lay audience. And the end result is comments like we started with.
Yeah, I've got one other quote from Kitzmiller v. Dover. It was the conservative Christian Republican Bush appointed judge
Mm-hmm.
who complained that, he said it is ironic that several of these individuals representing the Discovery Institute would staunchly and proudly touted their religious convictions in public, would time and again lie to cover
Mm-hmm.
their tracks and disguise the real purpose behind the ID policy.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, that was an example where they accidentally let the mask slip and they were explicit about what the point is. And since then, everyone's trying to be real careful about to, not do that again. Yeah, but that's what it is.
Well, Doctor, thank you very much for helping out with this project.
Always happy to. Thank you.
And do you have any? I have your links. Is there anything else you want to share about how people find you, or what pitch whatever you're doing, whatever?
Yeah. So my channel is called Creation Myths. I basically do this. I take scientific creation claims and break them down. Try to make it accessible to an audience that you don't have to have taken biology in college to understand it. So we'll look at things like irreducible complexity, created heterozygosity, genetic entropy, any of those fancy sounding creationist arguments. I'm going to try to break those down and show using, in some cases, extraordinarily generous assumptions in the math and show how they just completely faceplant no matter what. So if that sounds like something you want to hear more about, come check me out. It's Creation Myths is the name of the channel. This is what I do.
Thank you very much, sir.